I'm pleased to have received the ascertainment from GSA to carry out a smooth and peaceful transition of power.
I won, by the way, but, we'll find that out. Almost 74 million votes.
As President Trump makes way for the transition process to begin, President-elect Biden forges ahead with key cabinet appointments. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. The transition process towards a Biden administration was formally put in motion earlier this week, despite President Trump's continued refusal to accept defeat. The transition had been held back for over 2 weeks by the administrator of the General Services Agency, tasked with ascertaining the apparent winner of the election. The Trump appointee, who was facing mounting pressure, cited, quote, recent developments involving legal challenges and certification of election results in her decision to allow the transition to move forward. Several battleground states, including Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, have now certified the election results. This will give President-elect Biden and his team access to intelligence briefings, data on the pandemic, and transition funds needed for a smooth transfer of power. While Biden has announced several key foreign policy and national security appointments, including longtime advisor Antony Blinken as Secretary of State, as well as former Secretary of State John Kerry as Special Presidential Climate Envoy, President Trump has announced major policy decisions, including the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq and Afghanistan, and plans to sell billions of dollars of weapons to the United Arab Emirates. His administration is also planning to impose more sanctions on Iran. Now, with the Biden administration set to inherit a series of global challenges, will it be able to turn things around and restore America's standing around the world? I'm joined by retired U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He was Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell during the George W. Bush administration. Colonel Wilkerson, good to have you on the program. As you know...
Good to be with you.
Thank you. As you know, there's been a lot of praise for Biden's foreign policy and national security teams. As someone who knows the foreign policy and the military establishment in Washington, D.C. very well, do you think that his team will be up to the task of restoring the standing of the United States in the world, re-injecting confidence in the U.S.'s traditional allies, and resetting some of the alliances that have been driven more by personal relationships over the last 4 years than national security requirements?
I do think the Biden team will bring some domestic tranquility, particularly after the tumultuous 4 years of Donald Trump, and it will bring some stability in alliances and in international relations and so forth. But I have to hasten to add that the Biden team is no different from the Obama team in my regard, for which he was vice president, of course. And I'm really leery of what the Biden team might mean with regard to such things as these endless wars we seem to be engaged in, and the things that go along with those endless wars, like the draining of the United States Treasury.
As you point out, many of the people who've been tapped to play a key role in the next Biden cabinet were part of the Obama administration. Some people are suggesting that the expectations need to be lowered, that we might see more alliances, but as you point out, that there could also be a return to more U.S. interventionism. Tony Blinken, the next Secretary of State, supported the war in Iraq, which you were a fierce critic of. He was also for military interventions in Libya and Syria.
Yes, and the latter one really troubles me because I've made a deep study of the Libyan intervention, as have my students over the past 15 years, and that's a disaster. You had a president who didn't want to do it, and you had a Secretary of Defense and a Vice President, incidentally, Biden, who didn't want to do it. And then he let Samantha Power and Susan Rice and Hillary, after she went to Tripoli and came back, persuade him otherwise. And it turned out to be a disaster. Libya is a wreck right now, and arms are spread all across the Middle East and North Africa to every terrorist group operating there. So I'm really worried about things like that, which, as you point out, Blinken supported.
But how much of a mess is Biden and his team inheriting? Some people are suggesting that the outgoing Trump administration is trying to light as many fires as possible, that it may be too much for this new incoming team to put out all these fires at once.
Yes, and in particular with Iran, which is a heavy account for Joe Biden. Pompeo has done everything that he possibly could, Elliot Abrams, Brian Hook before him, to contaminate the waters with Iran, to make it almost impossible to first re-enter the JCPOA and have Iran be compliant, and second, to unravel the sanctions, which are quite complex and difficult to unravel. So, and on top of all of this, look at what Biden's going to inherit. By all measures, he's going to inherit a plummeting economic situation for at least the first year, a disaster for him to deal with that'll probably be worse than the situation in 2007 and 8. And he's got the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccine distribution and so forth to do. This is going to be a very busy president from day one.
A busy president from day one, but there's also 2 more months to go, more or less, for this outgoing administration, and a lot could happen between now and the 20th of January. What do you make of the personnel changes? In Washington, they often say personnel is policy. We just saw how the acting Secretary of Defense changed the line of command at the Pentagon, putting a new civilian head of special operations, a 34-year-old named Ezra Cohen-Watnick, known for his right-wing beliefs. Why would the acting Defense Secretary do this at such a late stage?
Yeah, Ezra came right out of the Frank Gaffney shadows. That is to say, I think he's a disaster, so I have no idea what he's going to do. But I think Trump's main moves with regard to the Pentagon were to expedite what he's wanted to do all along and has been unable to do, partly because of opposition from the military and even the civilians in the Pentagon, and that is get the U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. He doesn't care what the deal looks like. He just wants the troops out. And I think that's the real reason he did the shuffling at the Pentagon at the last minute.
But is that a good thing in the long term? He wants troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq, and he says he wants them out by the 15th of January, just 5 days before Biden actually takes office. The U.S. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who doesn't often disagree publicly with the president, voiced his concerns. This is what he said.
I think it's extremely important here in the next couple of months not to have any earth-shaking changes with regard to defense and foreign policy. I think a precipitous drawdown in either Afghanistan or Iraq would be a mistake.
Would it be a mistake? Or is it about time that the United States pulled out its troops from these countries?
As much as I'm in favor of what you just said, it is about time. This is one time that McConnell, and very few and rare are these times, has been right, that the military cannot conduct what will be probably a withdrawal under fire, one of the most complicated military operations to conduct, that fast. So it needs to take a little more time. I'd say 3 to 5 months at least to get all those troops out if we're going to take them out. And then you've got to consider the aftermath. Will the aftermath of a precipitate U.S. withdrawal in both countries produce a situation that's even worse than it is right now with the troops there? That's an analysis that I don't think's been conducted very well. So they need to take a look at that.
What about the wider region? Because the outgoing administration is also seemingly trying to change as many facts on the ground as it can. Mike Pompeo is the first sitting Secretary of State to visit Israeli settlements in the West Bank. He also went to the Golan, from where he said this.
You can't stand here and stare out at what's across the border and deny the central thing that President Trump recognized that previous presidents had refused to do, that this is a part of Israel, and a central part of Israel.
Why would the Secretary of State in the last few weeks of this administration try to push so many boundaries? Is this all part of a long-term domestic political agenda?
It's a vision of the evangelicals, now 100 million strong in the United States. I call it the Third Great Awakening, if you're familiar with our history. And the rapture, the end times, and so forth, and Israel's being necessary to that theory. Pompeo is a very powerful subscriber to the end times doctrine. So his remarks were preposterous, even more preposterous coming from the mouth of a Secretary of State. Look at what we've done to Israel. And Netanyahu is complicit in this majorly. We have allied Israel now with some of the worst tyrannies in the region, tyrannies that are not going to last. 400 million Arab people under those tyrannies are going to eventually have another Arab spring, if not an Arab winter. And those are going to fall. And where's the United States and Israel going to be? This
But
may
is that
look
going to
good
change?
for short
Is that
term.
going to change? Because you know that Biden is an old friend of the Israeli political establishment. He and Netanyahu share
Very
a
much so.
warm relationship that goes back to almost 40 years. He said if he were Jewish once when he served in the Senate, that he'd be a Zionist. He may not go as far as Trump, but can Palestinians really count on Biden to reverse any of the administration policies on Israel? We already know that he doesn't
No.
intend to move the U.S. Embassy back to Tel Aviv.
I don't think so. I think we've made it a fait accompli now. And by making it a fait accompli, I'll make a prediction. Israel will not be a democratic Jewish state in 20 years or less, or it will be a Jewish state, totalitarian and apartheid. Now, I'm not in favor of either one of those outcomes, but those are the two outcomes that are now very much in the making.
But a new generation of Democrats, as you know, on Capitol Hill wants to condition military aid to Israel. Will Biden, though, take such a political risk, or are we simply going to go back to hearing the usual lip service to the notion of a peace process and two-state solution?
I don't even think there will be a lip service to the peace process. I think a one-state solution is what everyone is looking at in the region and in the United States now. And they are going to present the rhetoric that that one state can remain Jewish and democratic. It can't.
And a lot of this, as you know, is driven by the so-called maximum pressure campaign to isolate Iran in the region at the behest of Israel and its U.S. Gulf allies. Trump apparently even floated the idea of bombing Iran a couple of weeks ago with his advisors. Biden was vice president when the nuclear agreement with Iran was signed. He has said that he may return to the deal if certain conditions were met. The Iranians have said they are not interested in renegotiating the deal. I spoke recently with the foreign minister of Iran. He told me what he thinks about the prospects of any rapprochement happening with an incoming Biden administration.
The United States has imposed a lot of hardship on the Iranian people. The United States has even prevented the Iranian people from access to COVID-19 medicine, in spite of what they're saying, which is a total lie. The United States has closed all our banking channels. So as far as violating, committing crimes against humanity, the United States has a very dark record of it. Whether Vice President Biden wants to change that policy, we will have to wait and see. We haven't seen anything.
Will Biden have the political will to rejoin an agreement that the United States violated, not Iran?
Well, he's already said he will, and so has the party conceded to that. But I take your points, and I take Foreign Minister Zarif's points too. And after all, Iran has an election in the late summer, and we're going to see an IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, member probably elected to the government in Tehran, and that's going to probably foreclose any renegotiation of the deal. And if I were Iran, why would I want to come back into the deal when in 2024 the Republicans might get elected again and they'd walk out again? So I think it's going to be an extremely arduous task for Biden to renegotiate or even to re-enter the deal. Now, if he does it swiftly, and he does it with this government, Rouhani, Zarif, and so forth, he might be able to succeed, but I don't think it'll be long-lasting, and I don't think negotiations on terrorism and ballistic missiles and other issues will ever take place. And that's what we need. We need a real dialogue leading to rapprochement with Iran. I don't see that happening.
How do you think the Biden administration will deal with Saudi Arabia? Trump gave Mohammed bin Salman a blank check. Will Biden treat the kingdom any differently? Will he end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen?
I've had conversations with people in the Biden group, and Jamal Khashoggi's murder really got them angry. Now, they seem to have put that aside for the moment, but MBS is still there, and MBS was responsible for that murder. I don't think they're going to treat Saudi Arabia like the bosom buddy that Donald Trump treated it, merely for business reasons because of the almost 300 million letter of intent for military weapons. I think it'll be a different relationship. I think it'll be a much cooler relationship.
But will we see the continuing arms sales to the region, to Saudi Arabia, but to the United Arab Emirates as well? Because as you know, the Trump administration has been putting a lot of efforts into selling more than $23 billion of weapon systems to the UAE. At least two Democrats on Capitol Hill and one Republican in the Senate have opposed this sale. But at the end of the day, even if it is delayed, will it ultimately go through? Will it be business as usual?
And even worse, Ghida, supporting Saudi Arabia in its brutal war in Yemen. I think that's the tip of the spear that we have to stop that. The U.S. Congress has already voted in both houses to stop it, and Trump vetoed it. Will Biden veto it if they bring it up again and pass it? I don't know. If he does, he'll show his true colors very early. But that's part of that situation with Saudi Arabia, the war in Yemen, and that needs to be dealt with swiftly.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, a great pleasure to have you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
So, as President-elect Joe Biden vows to recommit the United States to the international alliances and agreements that President Trump abandoned, he is also looking to reset America's relationship with the World Health Organization and roll back Trump's decision to pull the U.S. out of the organization. COVID-19, which has now killed over 250,000 people in the U.S., continues to claim between 1,000 and 2,000 lives a day. Yet, the Trump administration continues to praise its response to the pandemic. Here's Vice President Pence last week at the first Coronavirus Task Force press briefing since July.
America has never been more prepared to combat this virus than we are today.
Pence refused to take questions while the president himself hasn't attended a Coronavirus Task Force meeting in 5 months. Joe Biden, meanwhile, painted a less rosy picture after his own Coronavirus Task Force meeting, expressing dismay at the lack of information sharing by the Trump administration.
If nothing fundamentally changes between now and beginning of February, we're likely to lose up to total of 400,000 lives, another 150,000 lives. And there is no excuse not to share the data and let us begin to plan. Because on day one, it's going to take us time. If we don't have access to all this data, it's going to put us behind the 8 ball by a matter of a month or more. And that's lives.
With 2 promising U.S. vaccines set to receive emergency approval from the Food and Drug Administration and a 3rd vaccine reporting a rate of over 90% efficacy, can the next U.S. administration help global efforts to tackle the pandemic? Joining me now is Dr. David Nabarro, Special Envoy of the WHO Director General on COVID-19. Dr. Nabarro, the Trump administration announced in July that it was pulling the US out of WHO, accusing it essentially of being beholden to China and allowing the virus to spread around the world. Biden, on the other hand, says he will reverse this decision on the first day of his presidency. I suspect you must be relieved to soon have a new and more friendly interlocutor in the White House, are you?
Well, certainly it makes a huge difference. Just to stress to you what the World Health Organization really is. It's a collection of professional medical personnel who have come together from all over the world to work on major health problems. It's not very big. It's 1/3 of the size of the US Centers for Disease Control. It's not a political body, but its owners are working in the political sphere. And we, who are the professionals, depend hugely on the goodwill of our owners. If our owners are not happy with each other, then they will turn their anger on us. And because we really value working with American professionals, we value working with professionals from every country, it's very good news that the particular disagreement that was building up that led to the decision by the US to leave looks like it's going to be reversed. We think it's good for world health, and we are, as
Good
you
for
say,
world health.
relieved.
How good is it for the WHO to keep the largest donor in the US, I believe, contributed something like 15% of the budget last year. But beyond the financial incentive of keeping the United States in WHO, with major US pharmaceutical companies now producing some of the much needed vaccines, how crucial will it be for the US to join COVAX, the global coalition that is funding vaccines and their distribution to poorer countries? Do you expect Mr. Biden, when he is in charge, to join this coalition?
Well, it's really difficult to tackle a problem of this size without the major contributor being present. It's very difficult to imagine how we're going to be able to encourage the rollout of vaccines, in plural, to countries all over the world without the major contributor being present. And so that's why it makes a huge difference that the United States is planning to return. And we very much hope that the United States will contribute to the vaccination effort as it advances, and in particular to the shared purchasing facility called COVAX.
How important is it to have some of the major US pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, like Moderna, those that are developing these new vaccines, to join COVAX as well? Should they join? I know that there are discussions currently underway. Pfizer says it hopes to produce up to 50 million doses globally, but the US will apparently receive half of it. How important is it for it to join and to make sure that there is that equitable distribution of vaccines around the world?
The WHO was asked by the member states who own it to establish a program that would enable people of all nations to be able to access vaccine. Then it set up, together with partners, the COVAX program. Around 185 countries have joined COVAX. It's a program that enables countries to access vaccine at a low price. It also enables them to access vaccines that are proven to work. It's an excellent system for trying to ensure what we call equitable access. From my point of view, in dealing with the World Health problem, we need a global solution. And so
you say it's an excellent system, though, Dr. Nabarro, but the US already has agreements to purchase vaccine doses to cover 230% of its population. And according to some of the recent studies we've seen, it will eventually control 1.8 billion doses. That's a quarter of the world's near-term supply. You also have other countries that are part of COVAX, like Canada, that have already purchased, through advanced purchase agreements, enough vaccine doses to protect their population 5 times over. Is that an excellent system?
Well, of course, some countries will do bilateral agreements to purchase vaccine, and they have hedged their purchasing, i.e. they've ordered vaccine from several suppliers because they weren't sure when they did the orders which vaccines would work. But what I'm pleased about is some of those countries who've already bought their own supplies have also contributed to COVAX, which means that they're contributing to a global system that enables everybody to access vaccine. This is really good because it means these countries, as well as looking after their own people, they're looking after other people at the same time. Great. Very good.
Sure. But by doing this, though, aren't they undermining the spirit of COVAX? Rich countries are buying more than 5 billion doses of vaccines, and in comparison, just 800 million doses have been allocated to the world's poorest countries. So if the aim is to ensure the equitable distribution of vaccines, how counterproductive is it for wealthy countries to directly negotiate their own deals with these pharmaceutical companies?
Well, wealthy countries, all countries will do what they need to do. And then some of them will also contribute to this COVAX program, which is designed for poor people. You actually, in this kind of situation, really do rely on what you can get. And I think if countries are contributing to COVAX as well as buying their own vaccine supplies, that's a good thing. And if they have excess, I'm sure that they will make that available for other countries.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. David Nabarro. Great pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely to be with you.
With the long overdue and critical letter of ascertainment that set in motion the formal transition of power, allowing the president-elect to receive briefings on national security and coordinate the government's response to the pandemic, which is expected to kill 400,000 Americans by the time Biden assumes power next January, Trump has all but conceded and started his lame duck final weeks as commander-in-chief. He is no longer a constant fixture on television. His presidential tweets have become more rare, if still boisterous, while the pandemic continues to wreak havoc. His only concern appears to be his desperate attempts to undermine the outcome of the election in the eyes of almost 74 million Americans who voted for him, instead of working with the incoming administration on a plan to roll out promising COVID-19 vaccines. After a burlesque press conference by President Trump's most notorious lawyer, former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, a penultimate hurdle has been crossed, and the Biden administration has become a quasi-certitude after Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia certified the results of the votes, and Trump's legal challenges were thrown out of court. And so, in short, true to himself as the unpredictable president he has been, Trump seems willing to hand over to Biden a field littered with booby traps and challenges. Otherwise, why decide to withdraw 2,500 U.S. military personnel from Afghanistan at this late hour? Why ask Secretary of State Pompeo to visit illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank and Golan and reportedly meet secretly in Saudi Arabia with the Crown Prince and the Israeli Prime Minister? And why appoint a new civilian head of special operations at the Pentagon, known for his extreme right-wing views? As Americans celebrate Thanksgiving this week, the lame duck president may already be preparing their Christmas surprise. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry. Send us your thoughts. But for now, from me and the entire team in Washington, thanks for watching.